Just had a horrible thought. Pretty soon there's going to be a speech tax. I mean, they've taxed pretty much everything else. Is there a limit, however, on speech? And that's where we're going here. And we'll come back to that eco-tax thing throughout the show from a couple of different angles. But here's the headline in the National Post. Ontario police set to charge Muslim extremist. Over the past 3 years, Salman Hussein has openly called for terrorist attacks in Canada, cheered the killing of Canadian troops in Afghanistan, and urged fellow Muslims to exterminate Canada's Jewish population. When police started showing up at his suburban home in Mississauga, in 2007, this has been going on for a while, he was not chastened. He wrote that he honestly got a kick out of ticking off the RCMP. I changed the language a little there to clean it up. He writes, ha, 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 you can't charge me for possessing a thought. Well, he's possessing a thought. He's advocating an action. And this will be the first time in Canada that somebody will be charged with advocating genocide. The National Post again, he's expected to face charges of promoting hatred and quite possibly advocating a genocide. If so, it will mark the first time an advocating genocide charge has been prosecuted in Canada. The charges relate to hundreds of racist comments Mr. Hussein has posted on the internet. Joining me now, as he often does, to talk about these issues, Edward Prutschi, criminal lawyer, Adler, Botensky, and Prutschi. Edward, welcome.
Good morning, Jerry.
So what do you think? I mean, I think everybody recognizes there's a limit somewhere on free speech, isn't there?
Well, that's certainly the case in Canada. And Canada is unique from our neighbor to the south, as it were, where we are much more willing to apply limits to free speech. And there have been longstanding on the books laws that prohibit that. Now, this particular law, if he does in fact get charged with promotion of genocide, that would be a first as compared to still a rare charge, but one that has been utilized before, which is willful promotion of hatred.
Yeah. And, you know, there still are limits, by the way, in the United States as well.
Indeed, they are, although the balance there tends to shift a little bit more towards wide open free expression.
We would not see the comedian in British Columbia who offended some lesbians in the audience, or Mark Stein and Maclean's Magazine taken on by a government entity in the United States as we do here in Canada. So Canada is a little more aggressive, and I think in some cases too aggressive. But this is a really hateful person who, if he does not attack certain groups, especially Jews himself, is certainly trying to get other people to do it.
Well, indeed he does. And I mean, not that I recommend that anybody go and view his website or listen to his comments, but he's certainly made it as easy as possible, as one can imagine, to justify the laying of these charges. He's not mincing words in any respect. He's not hiding behind sort of vagaries of identifying the group or hinting at what he wants done to the group. I mean, he comes right out and says it and seems to fall squarely within the definitions of both promotion of hatred and promotion of genocide.
Yeah, he's not like Al Sharpton, who rails against the diamond merchants, which is just code for the Jews. But he just comes right out and says we need to nuke the Jews. I mean, he actually said we need to nuke the Jews.
I guess you have to give him credit at least for honesty, if nothing else.
Well, okay, but let me ask you, you're not involved in this case.
No.
Okay, but what if he came to you? How do you defend a case like this?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I mean, the obvious route is to attempt a constitutional challenge on the basis that it restricts freedom of expression. I'll be honest with you, and my assessment of that is it's not likely to succeed. The laws on willful promotion of hatred have been tested before, and while it may be difficult to prove intent in some circumstances, in this particular guy's case, I don't think it's going to be that difficult to prove.
No, he says, yes, I'm a fanatic. I'm ready to kill millions.
Right. I think more likely what you're going to see is a straight-out refusal of him to answer to the charges. I mean, he's not in Canada now. I doubt very much that he has any intention of returning to Canada. And so, to some extent, the laying of this charge may simply be, I mean, I don't want to be cynical and say it's purely a political move, but at least it just gives the government an opportunity to keep him from ever coming back here, and may make it a little bit easier to utilize some other legal tools to shut down the website or prevent it from appearing in Canada. But I'd be very surprised if he shows back up in Canada with the intention of defending himself on the charges.
But then what we would have going for us here is maybe then conversation with Bangladesh. That's where he is, I guess. He came to Canada from Bangladesh, where he was born, with his parents, who, by the way, seem aghast at how their son has turned out.
Right.
But Canada doesn't have an extradition treaty with Bangladesh, but Ottawa, I guess, could communicate with them and say, well, then you do something about it.
Yes, I mean the Department of Justice is open to open lines of communication with any country and seeking sort of on an ad hoc basis permission to prosecute or to have a person sent back. But in the absence of a formal extradition treaty, and we don't have one with Bangladesh, there isn't a set process on how that occurs, and there isn't any legal obligation for Bangladesh to actually respond to our request. So I know that at this stage, from what I've been reading, nobody in the Department of Justice and nobody in the government in Bangladesh are prepared to entertain hypotheticals about what might happen if such a request were made.
I'm wondering if I were in your position, you're the lawyer, not me. Edward Prutschi is with me, criminal lawyer Edward Prutschi, with just flat out craziness of the things he writes. Could some sort of criminal what am I looking for? Criminal insanity or something like that defense maybe work? You know what, Your Honor? He's just a nut.
Like every other offense in the criminal code, and this offense is no different, the Crown is still going to have to prove his intention beyond a reasonable doubt. So, that may be relatively easy in this case because he's been spouting on for so long and in such an explicit way. But if a question becomes whether this person is actually mentally ill and means the comments and actually intended to say what it is that he said, then that always is a defense. That's going to require some analysis of him on a personal level, a psychiatric level, and a psychological level, and we'll see where that lands.
Yeah, with the fact that he left Canada, that might be harder to do.
Well, he certainly seems, it's not going to happen unless he returns to Canada and actually faces charges, and he certainly seems very unapologetic about the situation. He was under investigation back when he was a student at York, and there was some talk about him doing some sort of rehabilitative measures, and things had settled down, which is why, ostensibly, the government sort of held back from prosecuting him for so long, because this is not a new story for this particular individual. He's been on the OPP's radar and on the government radar for quite some time.
Yeah. Hold on one second, Edward. Jerry Agar on News Talk 1010. National Post reports over the past 3 years, Salman Hussein openly called for terrorist attacks in Canada, cheering the killing of Canadian troops in Afghanistan, and urged fellow Muslims to exterminate Canada's Jewish population. He may now have gotten enough attention from Canadian authorities that he is expected later this afternoon to face charges of promoting hatred and quite possibly, for the first time in Canada, a charge of advocating a genocide. I'm talking to Edward Prutschi, criminal lawyer, Edward Prutschi. By the way, Hussein is now in Bangladesh, and that complicates this. However, it's important to bring these things forth and have decisions on just how much you can get away with your free speech. Now, you were talking about the fact that they kind of backed off on him because he was under some sort of program to help him understand and rectify his behavior. But immediately when he got released from the program, he went right back to it.
That seems to be the case. I mean, there aren't a lot of facts in terms of what actually he was doing to ameliorate this conduct, but there was a lessening of it, and he seemed to stop posting to the website for a period of time. And so I know that created some frustration within communities that were seeking to have him prosecuted, because the view of the Attorney General was that they weren't actually going to proceed on these charges. And what you have to remember that's somewhat unique about the two potential charges he could be facing is that they do require Attorney General approval before being laid. So it's not like the vast majority of charges in the criminal code where if a police officer feels that they've got reasonable grounds, they simply lay a charge and go ahead. This needs to go through a fairly significant high-level vetting process. And so that's taken quite a bit of time here in Canada, but they've reached the point, obviously, where they're comfortable with it.
Yeah, well, obviously they're not charging him with perpetrating a genocide. They're not charging him with going out and actually physically harming somebody, which has led him to sort of laughing it off and saying, you can't charge me for possessing a thought. But he's been charged with advocating a genocide.
Right, and he seems to misunderstand a little bit.
Or maybe charged with that. I'm sorry, maybe charged with that.
I mean, he's correct in that we cannot prosecute somebody for holding odious thoughts. However, where the law says you have crossed the line is when you start to publicize those thoughts and request other people to act on those thoughts. You now get into a situation where you're very much within the four corners of these promotion of genocide, promotion of hatred laws. Yeah, well,
he says some of the typical kinds of things you get from hateful people and stupid things like, the Jewish-controlled media in Canada and that kind of thing. And I don't think anybody's ever going to be charged with anything for just uttering a false and stupid statement. But it becomes quite different when you start talking about the necessity to kill all the Jews.
That's exactly right. And as I said before, he's made it very difficult for himself, because rather than hiding behind the typical somewhat vague rhetoric of the far right, he's come right out and said what he wants to happen. So he's identified the group as Jews. He has said that he wants them exterminated. He has said that he wants them killed. He has called specifically on Muslims to do that. And so he hasn't left himself a heck of a lot of wiggle room to, after the fact, explain, look, that's not really what I meant.
Why would you call it the rhetoric of the far right? I mean, we get this rhetoric from Al Sharpton, who's the far left.
You know, you're correct, and I shouldn't be placing it on sort of that kind of a spectrum, because it comes from both ends of the spectrum, no matter where you are. But it's basically what we're seeing is language that used to be associated entirely with Nazi groups and other such organizations that were typically politically speaking on the far right. The case today seems to be that we see that kind of rhetoric coming from extremes on both sides potentially.
Yeah.
But I think what's to be distinguished between this particular individual is a scenario where, as I said, he's not just utilizing the usual code words, and you alluded to that before about diamond manufacturers, for example.
Yeah, the diamond merchants.
Right. So he's come right out and said Jews, and he's come right out and said kill them, which is rather bold, even for extremists on any end of the political spectrum.
I guess there's going to be more information later this afternoon on what direction authorities are going to take, but thanks for your expertise on this.
Thanks very much, Jerry.
Edward Prutschi, criminal lawyer, Adler, Batensky, Prutschi.